Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Unraveler show. Tonight, we have a very special episode called Slavery Shackles Your Savior, and I dare you to try to say that 5 times fast. It is very challenging. With me tonight, my very special guests, Dr. Joshua Bowen and Dr. Kipp Davis. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me tonight for this very special episode.
Oh, thanks for inviting us, Alan. I feel very empowered after that intro.
Yeah, that was
Right?
I'm like, yeah, I'm charged up. I'm ready to go, man.
Yeah,
Good.
come on,
Let's rock it, because that's what we need to do, man. That was my goal. Let's charge these guys up and let's tell everybody how it is. So tonight we're talking about slavery. This is a very important topic when it comes to particularly Christianity, because we typically hear constant defenses for the Bible, for the biblical narrative as far as slavery is concerned, and defending God for the commands that he gave for slavery. Things like, well, it was a special kind of slavery, that it was more like an employer-employee type relationship, and that's the way it works. That's one thing that people tried to do to explain it. What wasn't chattel slavery, which we'll demonstrate is definitely incorrect. Things like, well, it wasn't as bad as the rest of the nations. Also a problem. But that's also an irrelevant concept, because that's like saying, well, as long as I beat my wife less than everybody else, then it must be okay. It's the silly argument. And it's just constant attempts to defend God and these texts on slavery. Another one is, well, you're atheist. You don't have any concept of morality anyway. And without being able to judge what's moral, how do you know that slavery is not moral? Things like that. Have you guys heard any other responses or defenses that we're going to overcome tonight in our discussion?
Yeah. I mean, what's funny about that is that it's a progression that you see. It's like stages. I don't know if anybody's ever been in an argument with with someone close to them, and they, you say X is, X, it's this, and then you say no, it's Y, and then you argue, and then you finally make your point, so much so that it's clear that you're right, and they go, yeah, but what about this thing? And they go by it, and you have to come back and then argue this one. That's what this is. Consistently for me is it always starts off really how you laid it out, Alan. It's like, that word slave. It's totally, this is totally, it's not the kind of slavery you're thinking about. And then you sit down and systematically walk them through. No, it is. Look, yeah, but the rest of the nations, right? It was better than that. Okay, yeah, it really wasn't, right? And here's why. Yeah, but and all of these things, and then it culminates, right, in what you said. Yeah, but how do you even ground your morality, right? It's like
there.
Oh my God, just say you've lost, right? It's just the thing that you were saying in the beginning. You lost that every step of the way here. And if really this is where, and I'll shut up, but this is really where it has gotten for me in this discussion, is that I get to the end of these conversations and it will either go to, Alan, what you said, you can't even ground your morality. Or they say, well, I guess slavery is not immoral.
Right.
That one's kind of scary.
No, totally. And Kipp, before you jump in, I just want to say, Josh, and for those who are listening, Josh wrote, does the Bible endorse slavery? It's an incredible book, and I encourage you to grab that. And so, Josh, this is one episode where you don't have to shut up. So don't even do that at all tonight.
On my account, that's for sure.
You seriously can talk all you want on this subject, and I would be grateful, because that's what this show's about. And you have a tremendous knowledge on this subject. So yeah, we definitely rather you talk than me, 100%. And you and Kipp can just go back and forth. I'll just throw in when I can. But that's what this is about, showing the world what the Bible actually teaches about slavery, so we can settle this once and for all, because it is absurd, the arguments that we continuously hear. Kipp, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to what Josh said. I'm continuously, it's both interesting and amusing. Some of the desperation of the sorts of apologetics that you will get with regards to this question. You know, where features of the phonetic alphabet are used as arguments for why slavery can't possibly uh, mean chattel slavery in the whole Old Testament was one that I just never had on my bingo card, like, ever, uh, until there it was, right? And it does feel very often like it is an issue where there there is no possibility to concede, no option to throw in the towel, no recourse to say, yeah, you're right about this and this is terrible, just because of the implications and because the stakes are so high. And it's also kind of ironic too, and maybe they're telling on themselves a little bit, but when I was still a believer in an evangelical, like in a pretty conservative evangelical environment, uh, we used to champion this idea that we were bond slaves to Christ.
Yep.
And I mean, I think I think, even though it's not something anybody really wants to talk about, I think that's a big part of what's at the heart of the discomfort that people have with actually being honest about what that means and about what the Bible actually says.
Right. No, that's great. So I'm gonna start this off by giving bookends of the Bible regarding slavery, and then you guys are gonna basically fill in all the center here because that's crucial. So I'm gonna give the first part of the bookend here at the beginning. I'm gonna deal with all the stuff in the middle, and then I'm gonna conclude it because especially based on what Kipp said, the bond slave idea of Christ, because I think it ties into the beginning and the middle. So here's how I'm gonna start this out. So the first thing I'm going to say is God Himself, Jehovah, Yahweh, El, whatever you call the opening chapter God of the Bible, He is the first enslaver of people who did not want to be enslaved and would not have even been aware that they were going to be enslaved because of an act that they did. So here's my case for that. In Romans 5-7 in particular, and other places in the New Testament, we see this idea that as human beings, or if you're in the preterist camp, regardless, the covenantal human beings, whatever, those group of people that are in Adam, whichever version you take, are slaves to sin. Right? I mean, that's a pretty general concept that you receive in Christianity. It's almost explicitly stated by Paul that humans are slave to sin. And so we needed redemption from the slavery. But why are they slaves to sin? It goes back to the Garden of Eden. It's because of Adam's sin, right? Adam and Eve sin, and he plunges humanity, or covenantal humanity, however you define it again, into slavery of sin and death, slavery to sin and death. Therefore, Adam and Eve, I suppose, are the first slaves of sin, right? That would have to be a logical deduction from that, because he's also our first high priest. He's also the first man. Therefore, he's the first slave, and all humanity falls into that category, or again, covenant man, whatever. So that, people that are in Adam are slaves of sin, because Adam is the father slave of sin. He's the first one put in slavery. When you go back to the beginning and you go back to the garden and you look at what's taking place there in the story, Adam and Eve are told, well, specifically Adam, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the idea is, if you do it, you will surely die. When you get to Genesis chapter 3, after they've already committed the act of sin and they've disobeyed God, you see God coming down and saying, now they are like us, knowing good and evil, which implies almost explicitly that prior to eating that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, that they were not like God, knowing good and evil. Therefore, they did not know good and evil prior to eating of that fruit. So how can they possibly have known it would have been an evil or wrong act to disobey God's command if they were unable to know what good and evil were prior to eating that fruit? It would be the equivalent to telling a baby on your shoulder, don't throw up on my shirt. If you do, I'm going to put you in the basement for the rest of your life. And the baby throws up on your shirt. Would it be moral to put that baby in the basement for the rest of their life? That would be one of the sickest acts a person can do, because the baby doesn't know. They're unaware. They're incapable of having the cognizance of doing what you asked them not to do. That is the situation where you're faced with in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are unaware of the knowledge of good and evil. They don't know what good and evil are yet. And so having them being told, don't eat of this or you will surely die, how can they possibly know, number one, that it was wrong to disobey God in that instance? And number two, that dying's a bad thing. How do they know? Maybe it's a good thing. They don't know good and evil yet. So it would be the equivalent of throwing them in the basement for the rest of their lives. God enslaved Adam and Eve for something that they were accountable for. You cannot punish somebody for something that they cannot possibly know is wrong or right. It would be evil to punish a baby the way we described. In the same way, it was evil to punish Adam and Eve and put them into slavery of sin and death for all eternity. And not only that, all of their posterity for generations and generations to come. So your grandparents, rob a bank. Therefore, 3 generations later, the children also have to go to jail? Ridiculous. None of this makes any sense. But God is the first enslaver of people who do not deserve to be enslaved. And therefore, it is an immoral act of God to do what he did to Adam and Eve and enslave them in the way that he did and his posterity after him. That sets the stage in the Bible for why it appears God is so embracing and endorsing of slavery in his laws. He never once denies it or tries to reject it or tries to say, hey, guys, I have an idea. Slavery is not such a good one. He just endorses it and gives commands about it. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. You guys are going to be able to demonstrate this. But God never once strays away from this enslavement idea for people being used as property against their will. It is a very sad scenario, but that's how I'm going to set the stage. And at the end, I'm going to bring it back full circle with the new covenant fulfillment of all this. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys now. And whoever wants to jump in, you pick up from there and, fix my mess or do whatever you want with that and begin. Let's talk about the rules and the laws that God gives for slavery then.
Kipp, you want to start? Or
you go ahead.
Yeah, I think, to sort of segue into that, this is one of the real dangers, I think, of seeing univocality between, the books that one considers to be canonical. And while I think it's fine for people to have interpretive approaches, obviously we all have to have interpretive approaches to texts. I think when one's interpretive approach becomes like prescriptive, required to be in the in group in order to have eternal life, that's where it starts to get problematic. But Alan, as you're saying, the idea that humanity is there for God's purpose is not something new to the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, when we think about earlier, let's say Mesopotamian mythology, humanity is created specifically to serve the gods. This is what they do. So if some very famous stories, Atrahasis, the Akkadian myth, You can also see this in. I mean, I won't go into all of that. Atrahasis is a fine example. The senior gods force the lower gods to perform the tasks of irrigation, farming, growing of crops, feeding the senior gods. And in so doing, after a while, they start to complain about the work that they have to do. And there's this uprising, and ultimately it gets settled. The senior gods agreed to create another type of being in order to take the work off of the shoulders of the lesser gods. And that, of course, is humanity. Humanity is created to do that work. And so now humanity is there to serve the gods. They, build their temples, maintain their temples, feed them, clothe them. This is what they do. And of course, it's that background that we bring into the Genesis narrative. And of course, if we can let go of this broader theology, what you're describing, Alan, that so many Christians hold on to tenaciously, and read these earlier texts through that later interpretive lens, you could sort of free yourself from that, and then see the Genesis narrative, particularly that primeval history, with its greater significance, and what it actually intends. And here, and Kipp, I know you could wax eloquent about this far more than I could, but the point here, and this is important, I think, is that the Genesis narrative early on, I think, is a counter to Mesopotamian concepts of reality and what they consider to be important and how they considered it to be important. And I think one of the things that it's sort of trying to turn on its head is serving the deity. Under Mesopotamian theology, it is arduous. It is something that isn't, that people, the lesser gods rebelled because they had to do it. So it's not this great thing, this fun thing that they're supposed to do. In the Hebrew Bible, I think that there is a spin on this where it isn't intended to be arduous. It isn't intended in the beginning to be this, back-breaking work. It's only after humanity disobeys that it becomes arduous. But even then, and I'll shut up. Sorry, I know I'm not supposed to say that. Sorry. But for Kipp's sake, at least, I will shut up. Even in the Holiness Code, in Leviticus 25, a passage that I'm sure we're going to talk about ad nauseum tonight, Yahweh says that you cannot make fellow Israelites, slaves any longer. And the reason that you can't, Yahweh says, is because they are my slaves. They're mine. No man can serve two masters. These are my slaves. And so you can't sell my slave to somebody else. You can't enslave my slave because they're mine. So if you want slaves, where are you going to get them? You get them from people that aren't my chosen people. You get them from the nations around you. You get them from foreigners living in their midst. And so, yeah, I think the notion of the Hebrew Bible is that, and this is why this is so insidious to me, is that once you figure that out, then you say things like, oh, well, as long as we do slavery right, as long as we have good masters, then it's okay. Then it's not bad. And that's where I think it becomes very insidious.
It's just regulating.
Yeah, just regulating.
Yeah. I think this is one of the big problems of seeing the scriptures, seeing the Old Testament, seeing the Hebrew Bible through this decidedly Christian lens. This idea of the new covenant, where everything gets reduced to the factors of this new thing, and this new relationship. Because something that I remind people over and over again when we approach this story in Genesis chapter 2 and 3 is just how badly we have misunderstood what's actually going on here by virtue of the way that it has consistently been presented to us through contemporary Christian theology. And for example, one of the things that I continually remind people is that there is no sin in the garden. There's no transgression. The words commonly associated in Hebrew for wrongdoing or sin or rebellion or these sorts of activities that everybody would deem to be in error, in rebellion against the gods. They're just completely absent from the story. So maybe this is a story that's not about that, despite the way that the Apostle Paul and then centuries of Christian theologians have presented this story to us as this great tragedy of human failure, resulting in this cosmic, in this punishment of cosmic proportions. Is it twists things, I think, pretty far from where the writers of this story and the first readers of this story understood this story to be going. I will say one thing about something else that that I often hear from Christian theologians in terms of this conversation is that slavery was never God's idea, that slavery was never God's design, that it wasn't part of the idealized mandate for humanity, and that it was something that was imposed somehow inappropriately by people on this perfect world that God had made, which I think is also just a very flawed, inaccurate view of what's going on, in particular in the second creation story. I mean, Josh and I just recently watched an apologist attempt to make the case. I actually think you had stepped out of my very, very long stream at that point, Josh. But
just like Josh, just leave in the middle.
I just I mean, I guess I don't have to stream for 3 hours, but what are you gonna do? So the we're listening to this Christian apologist make this point that the whole point of making people and putting them in the garden was for relationship with God, to be friends of God, to sit and learn from God. And I'm like, you've got to actually sit down and read the text and look at what the texts are telling us. And what the texts are telling us is not any of that when it comes to describing the purpose of humanity in the second creation story in the Garden of Eden. It's to work and to keep the garden. The noun, sorry, the verb for work is avad, from which the noun eved is derived, and the word eved means slave. it's a kind of servitude. It's a kind of enslavement that's built right into the design. People miss it in both directions, and it causes problems, I think, for them. But yeah, so in a weird way, Christian theology is missing the point by trying to sanitize their own discomfort with enslavement. Um, but then so doing also just um completely what's the word I'm looking for? They yeah, well, maybe I'll just leave it at that.
No, that's great. So so one of the thoughts I had as you were saying that is you know how you can shorten your 3-hour streams to an hour and a half? Just talk as fast as I do. Problem solved. You get you get the same amount of information in. You just talk so fast nobody can catch it.
My brain doesn't work that fast.
You're gonna be amazed how many mistakes you can make and nobody even notices. Anyway, back to seriousness. So no, I love all that, and I think it's good. So no matter what you do in the opening narrative there in Genesis, you find slavery. Is the point? Like you just can't escape it, and it's all coming from this original storyteller God that supposedly started this whole thing, and right out the gate, he's enslaving people. It's just mind blowing, and granted, nobody wants to recognize in that story because it sounds terrible to call God an enslaver unless you use the excuse, right? That, oh, well, it's a different kind of slavery, right? It's the bond slave. It's the good kind of indentured servitude where you love serving your master, whatever. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to get into that right now. Josh, why don't you take us there then? Because before we even talk about chattel slavery, let's just focus in on this excusable idea of this indentured servitude, that God's a wonderful God for giving people an opportunity to be enslaved for paying off debt, right? I mean, that's really the argument. And they try to make it sound like it's an employer-employee relationship, which is nothing to do with paying off debt. And you can also walk away whenever you want, right? So you're not there, and you're not bound, and you're not being owned. So it's just frustrating me. But I'm going to let you speak to that right now. Take your time, because this is probably maybe the most important point of the episode right now. So go.
Yeah. And this is the danger, right? Because I think that if we allow people to keep the conversation solely on, these more abstract concepts of being like a slave to Yahweh or a slave to Jesus, it can sort of whitewash. It can certainly take away from the reality of what the laws in the Hebrew Bible actually said. So I think that's good that you're steering it this way. The first place, so there are basically two major kinds that people talk about, but there are basically three kinds of slavery endorsed in the law collections of the Hebrew Bible. And when I say endorsed, at a minimum, what I mean by that is sanction, right? It's public approval of something. It doesn't necessarily carry the connotation of like a sports player holding up a drink and saying, I endorse, cola or whatever. That being said, there are obviously parts like that about the social institution of slavery. But anyway, I'm using it in the sense of something like sanction, right? To say, like, here's what you do, right? I approve of this. I approve of this practice. So, yes, Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25 are the three major passages that speak to this in the law collections of the Hebrew Bible. There are sort of more peripheral passages that come up under discussion, which are important, but don't have the same, weight. Passages like Deuteronomy 20 and 21, Deuteronomy 23. These are passages that come up in this discussion. But the big three, are Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25. So for Israelites, usually, not exclusively, but in the text, usually it's debt slavery. So Exodus 21, 2-6 speaks to a male Hebrew slave. If that male Hebrew slave is either sold or sells himself, it's debated how we should take that, to another Israelite, then they are to serve for 6 years at a maximum, and they are to be released in the 7th, and their debt is wiped out at that point from the 6 years of service. The law stipulates 3 sub cases. The first is if he comes in single, then he goes out single. If he comes in with a wife, then his wife is to go out with him, which is something we don't ever spend any time on. But the fact that his wife comes in with him. And then the third situation is if he comes in single and his master gives him a wife. And the woman there, I'm using wife. I'm trying to be very liberal here with this, but the word is isha. It just means woman, right? So it doesn't necessitate this idea of marriage. But I usually just grant that for the sake of argument. So whatever it is on that spectrum of a slave marriage, and they have children together, when the debt slave, the male debt slave, exercises, if he decides to exercise his right of release in the 7th year, the law says that he goes out alone, explicitly goes out alone, and the wife and the children belong to the master. So this is again, these 2 characters, the wife and the children, they tend to fall into the background because they're there to sort of move the law along. But if we're interpreting this, in a different way, like we're actually considering the reality of this law, these are chattel slaves. The wife and the children are owned as property. That child is referred to as a yalid bait. Children that are born into slavery, which is what that child is, are actually very valuable slaves, not only in the Hebrew Bible, but in the wider ancient Near East. So someone who is born of the household is, and you can see this in places like Ecclesiastes 2:7, where the Kohelet says, like I had purchased slaves and I had houseborn slaves, right? I had them all. And so there is a clear example, even for Israelites, that you could have the more common, according to the law collections, the 6-year debt service. Now, during that 6-year term of service, they are not free to leave. Like this is, as you were saying, Alan, this is sort of a common misnomer. They can't just go 2 weeks in. Well, I'm out.
Yeah, I'll find another way to pay you.
Yeah,
you don't get to do that.
You don't get to do that, and we know this not only from the Hebrew Bible, and from common passages like 2 Kings 4:1 is a really good example of this, where the wife who was a wife of one of the sons of the prophets goes to Elisha and says, "We're defaulting on our loan here to our creditor, and he's coming to take my 2 sons away, right, as slaves." It's not a good thing. They're not thinking, she's not going, yes, now I don't have to care for my 2 sons anymore. This is great. So this is here in Exodus 21. And Kipp, if you want to do any of this, just say, Josh, I'll take it from here. But we see a similar passage in Deuteronomy 15, 12-18, which sort of develops in some ways Exodus 21. One of the things that it develops from Exodus 21, 2-6, is that when that slave, that male debt slave, is released, and in this case also a female debt slave, they are to be provided for liberally by the master. And so this is a more humanitarian development in Deuteronomy. There's a reason behind it. And again, remember, it's only for Israelites. But this is developing Exodus 21, 7 through 11, which is a man selling his daughter as an amah in the Hebrew, which is like a maid, a female slave. And the text explicitly says female slave does not go out as the male slaves do. So Deuteronomy 15 is sort of responding to this, most scholars think, and making this apply both to the male slave and the female slave. So without going into a whole bunch about that, we've seen, even in this passage thus far, both chattel slavery, that is, people owned as property, lifelong servitude, and debt slavery, which is temporary by nature, ostensibly. Now, it theoretically could turn into chattel slavery, as it does there in Exodus 21, 2-6. If he decides to stay, he becomes a chattel slave.
Right.
In light of this, in Exodus...
Josh, one second.
Please, yeah.
Before you go any further, can you, for the listening audience, because they may not know, can you define chattel slavery, just so we know what we're talking about? Yeah.
So chattel slavery is essentially when someone is owned as property. And in these contexts, it essentially means it's differentiated from debt slavery in that the slavery is contingent upon the repayment of a debt in debt slavery. And the law considers in most cases that this person is ostensibly going to go free, right? Go back to their previous status, whatever that was. And so generally, not only in the Hebrew Bible, it appears, but why in the wider ancient Near East, there tend to be more restrictive laws, particularly for the physical treatment of a debt slave. Whereas chattel slaves, because they are permanent in nature, there is no required release of a chattel slave. They're owned as property and they're passed on as inherited property. We don't have specific laws about the treatment of chattel slaves in the Hebrew Bible law collections.
Isn't is the law about not beating your slave as long as they don't die within 3 days or whatever? Isn't that chattel slaves, or is that the Israelite?
No, so that's in Exodus, and I think it's important to point this out. And it's good that Josh started in Exodus 21, because this is the earliest of the law collections in the Hebrew Bible. And if you read the text carefully, this entire set of rulings about slaves, you will see that this is applicable, that the only view of the writer of this particular set of laws is this relationship of Hebrew slaves to their owners. These are Hebrew debt slaves. There is just no consideration at all for debt slaves within this piece of legislation. So everything in there has to be understood just within this relationship. And just as Josh was talking, and I don't know if I've ever really thought too much about this before. I mean, with all the thinking that Josh has done about slavery in the Bible, maybe he has, but just, why aren't there any rules in the oldest of the law codes about chattel slavery and their treatment? And I suspect one of the reasons for this is just my suspicion, but even just to mention them, right? My suspicion is that the silence on the matter is more damning than anything, in terms of just maybe a tacit recognition that you don't, there doesn't have to be any laws, because they are your property in perpetuity, and you can do whatever you see fit with them. Nobody needs to govern those relationships. There don't have to be any stipulations on those relationships.
Yeah, you don't see them as humans. You see them as
I don't like making that distinction, not seeing them as humans, because I tend to think that that's a more like a modern perspective of these sorts of relationships. In antiquity, slavery wasn't based on, in antiquity, in the ancient Near East, it wasn't based on a view that there were levels of humanity. It was more to the effect that you were, I mean, anybody could be a slave or anybody could be enslaved. It's just a matter of which side of that coin you were lucky enough to fall on most of the time. So it didn't have to do with your intrinsic value as a person or a human being. It was just, the lot. It was just a lot in life, what
so it
you were
wasn't
dealt.
so it's the way you see it. It wouldn't have been to the same degree that that American slavery was, where
Like,
black
it's
were considered less than.
so
Well,
it's yeah. Go ahead, Josh.
yeah, and again, I want to be really careful, and Kip, definitely want to come back to what you were saying. But we want to be really careful when we bring up the antebellum South. And the reason that we do, and I feel like this is a battle that we have to fight all the time, is that what apologists generally do, and I don't necessarily fault them for this, because this is the way the brain functions, I imagine. Not that that's my field, but it seems pretty common, is that we associate, when we think of the word slave, we're not thinking about the laws of the antebellum South, right? What we're thinking about are the atrocities. And not to say that the laws weren't atrocities. I think that they were. But we're not considering what the law stipulated about slavery. We're thinking about what actually took place, right? And I think that it's fair, so that I'm throwing every apologist out there a bone here. I think it's absolutely fair and correct to say, well, now, wait a minute. We have to set our definitions. When we talk about slavery or slave, what are we referring to? It's absolutely fair. And it's a truism, right? We do that about everything when we do lexicography. In the same way that if you come to Elijah's is made some cakes, right? Nobody sits there and thinks, well, I mean, cake to be, happy birthday, right? Get some icing. Is that what Elijah was doing? No, come on, so we can't just import that meaning. Okay. But with the antebellum South, when we talk about this, we have to look at, if we're looking at the laws in the Hebrew Bible, we have to then compare those laws to the laws in the antebellum South, in my opinion. And when you look at the laws in the antebellum South, they say things like, based on the one who is, actually, I just want to read it quickly, if that's okay with everybody.
That was almost a Wes Huff moment there, except it was your own book.
Oh, sorry. I must admit that I didn't actually watch much of what Wes Huff said.
It's too funny.
Is that bad?
Alan knows what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. While he's looking for that, though, Kip, can you clarify just one question for me then?
Yeah.
Maybe others are asking. So are you saying that Exodus 21,
Yeah,
the laws all laid out there, have nothing to do with foreign slaves? Everything in that chapter is Israelite slaves.
I mean, there are certainly commenters who attempt to make the case that you can include foreign slaves under these rules, but I think if you just read through the collection of laws that are there straightforwardly as they are written, you come to this conclusion that this is only about Hebrew debt slaves. This does not include chattel slaves. So the passage about beating your slave and making sure that you don't treat them too harshly, like that is just exclusive to debt slaves.
So So I'm sorry to interrupt, but but that's just before you go on. That's just so so fascinating to me because if that is about the debt slaves from within Israel, that goes to show that this can't be contrary to what so many try to argue. Well, it's just like an employee-employer relationship.
Yeah, no.
What employer has the right to beat their slave in any way, shape, or form? You know, their employee. That's absurd.
And I think it's built right in there to the text, right? Like when you read it, it says in the concluding statement, it says he is your money. He is your silver, which can be understood to mean he is your property. But I think saying it in that respect is, an indicator that this is the repayment of your debt. It doesn't matter really what you do with things that are yours or your property in this sort of perspective, but it does matter when you only own as much of this person as they are obligated to repay you. So it's
but
not
in theory, like when you think about what you're describing here, if you can beat somebody like this, right?
Mhm.
It goes to show how much property of yours they actually are, and they don't have a right to walk away and say, you know what, buddy, I'm going to go find another job and use that job to pay you off, because that's what you can do if you're not owned. But if you're somebody's property, that's true slavery. You can't just walk away from that and say, I'm tired of being beat by you. I'm going to go pay you off. I promise you I'll pay you, but I'm going to do it I'm going to find another job. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
You got it, Josh?
Yeah, so I'll read the short paragraph before it, and then I'll read the actual law. A similar law was adopted in North Carolina in 1791. So 1791, and just so that everybody knows, from the research that I've done, the people that work in this field in this period, the laws got more humane the closer we got to the antebellum South. The closer we got to the Civil War. So here, a similar law was adopted in North Carolina in 1791, outlawing the deliberate homicide of a slave. The earlier law of 1774 had made it so that, quote, killing of a slave, however wanton, cruel, and deliberate, is only punishable in the first instance by imprisonment and paying the value thereof to the owner. However, this act sought to rectify what was considered highly inappropriate. Here's the actual wording of the law. Which distinction of criminality between the murder of a white person and of one who is equally an human creature, but merely of a different complexion, is disgraceful to humanity and degrading in the highest degree to the laws and principles of a free, Christian, and enlightened country, be it enacted that if any person shall hereafter be guilty of willfully and maliciously killing a slave, such offender shall upon the first conviction thereof be adjudged guilty of murder and shall suffer the same punishment as if he had killed a free man. And then it tacks on at the end here. Any law, usage, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. And this is what Finkelman writes, Paul Finkelman writes, who's scholar of the period. He says, the new laws, such as North Carolina's Act of 1791, making the murder of a slave a felony, in part reflected some of the liberal thought of the Revolution. The closing of the African slave trade by the states during the Revolution also helped reduce inhumane treatment because slaves who died from punishment or maltreatment could no longer be easily and cheaply replaced. So I guess my warning to apologists who make defenses of biblical slavery that could, in many cases, just as easily be made of laws like that. Can you imagine if the law in Exodus 21 read that way? He is a human creature just like you. He's just foreign. right? They would be all over that image of God. Look at this. I mean, look, they do it now with Job 31:13, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Job owns his slaves, but he says, I don't deny them justice because they're born from a mother's womb just like I am. And they're like, look at this. Look, you atheists. And it's like, oh my God, would you do that with this law in 1791? I mean, no, of course you wouldn't. You wouldn't be like, look, the slavery in the antebellum South must not have been bad. Now watch, somebody will clip that and have me going, the slavery in the antebellum South wasn't that bad.
That's how this works. That's
Yeah,
how
it
this
really
works.
does. But that probably shouldn't have put that idea in somebody's mind. But the point is that, yeah, we've got to be careful when we make comparisons to the antebellum South, because you're absolutely right, Alan. If we're thinking about the most horrific atrocities that people of color underwent in the American South, then yeah, obviously, right? If you were to compare those things to the laws in any ancient Near Eastern country, any ancient Near Eastern law collection, there would be worlds apart, right? But also, if you compared them to the actual laws in the antebellum South, they would be worlds apart, right? So,
yeah, and
I
the
don't know
fact
how
that you described that they got better and better over time. I mean, you made the point that by implication, since those laws weren't in the Hebrew scriptures, it goes to kind of imply that neither God nor the Israelites saw the foreign slaves as equality with them, as something made in God's image. They weren't considered as made in God's image.
Yeah, because I think we read, and Kipp could talk about this at length. We read so much into that, Genesis 1:26 and 27. But here's the hurdle, is we're talking about Exodus 21. If you look at 28 to 32, it's something that you wouldn't think would come up necessarily in a slavery discussion. But in 28 to 32, this is a law it's a negligence law about an ox that gores. And this is one that's common to ancient Near Eastern law collections. You see it in at least two others. I think at least two others, Laws of Eshnun, and I think another one. Hammurabi, I think maybe is where the other one's at. But you have these types of laws where, like, if a man builds a house and the wall falls down and kills somebody, that's a negligence law. If a man has a dog that is known to bite and doesn't, keep control of it and bites somebody, negligence law, right? If somebody digs a hole, doesn't cover the pit, or uncovers the pit, doesn't fill it back in or something, and somebody falls in and hurts themselves or dies, or something, negligence law. And that's what this goring ox law is. It's one of these negligence laws. And so the laws, if a guy's got an ox and it's known for goring at people, right? Going at them with his horns. And somebody tells him, yo, like, come get your boy. And the master doesn't, the owner of this ox does not do that, and it gores someone, then the text says, here are the punishments, right? Here's what's to happen. If it gores a free person, be it a free man, a free woman, or one of their children, the life of the owner of the ox is forfeit. It's lex talionis. And the family of the victim has the ability to allow the owner of the ox to pay his way out, to ransom his life. They can allow him to do that. They don't have to, but they can. And if the text stopped there, like, it wouldn't mean anything. But then verse 32 says, and if the ox gores a slave. Now, if this were an made in the image of God passage, right? And we are trying to make the argument that the law sees the slave in the image of God, and so therefore its life is valued the same as anybody else's. What will we expect to see? Owner's life is forfeit, right? But it's not. The text says the owner is to pay 30 shekels of silver to the owner, to the master of the slave.
That's crazy.
I mean, this is one of the interpretive hurdles that I think you have to get by, and it's very difficult to do. But it's clear, and this is not Kipp. Then I'm done. But this is what we have to do when we talk about slavery. We talk about what kind of slavery we're discussing. What are the characteristics of it? We have to look at the context of these passages, and we have to be able to say, okay, like the slave, the eved, same Hebrew word that's being used there and in Exodus 21:32, the eved in 20 to 21, 26 to 27 is being treated more under family law than under property law. However, in 32, it's very clear he's being treated under property law because it's the same as if, somebody wrecked a car and you had to pay the value of the car to the owner of the car. Right? That's what the law is dealing with. So it's in those ways that scholars of A&E law and the Hebrew Bible come to these passages and say, okay, how do we categorize more finely in a more nuanced way what kind of a slave this was considered?
Wow. Kipp, I don't want to take too much time here with my questions that I have a couple here, but because I'm sure there's a whole avenue you can talk from here. But you actually may know the answers to the questions I'm about to ask. So Josh, earlier you talked about that law where it's the third option that if you're a debt slave, after your 6 years, you get to go free. But if you have the Isha that the master gave you, he still owns her. And of course, if you love her, you can stay, and then you become a slave for life. He, he pierces your ear or whatever, and you're his slave for life with your Isha and the children, right? So It got me thinking as you were talking about that, because it triggered my mind to betrothal and marriage laws in Israel. So under the betrothal law, the Isha, the wife, was considered a wife, much like Mary was considered the wife of Joseph, though they were not yet married, theoretically, the way it would have been finalized and they would consummate. So they were still betrothed, but in that culture, you called betrothed people, you called them husband and wife, even in the betrothal period. So under the betrothal law, the wife was still considered the slave of the husband until they got married, and then she became a free woman. They became equal in that capacity, in that sense, even though she still was under him in the headship concept, but she wasn't technically owned by him, because in the betrothal context, everything she had belonged to him. He owned it, even though it was hers. It belonged to him. That's the way it worked. And so he had the right to do whatever he wanted with it. That's just a picture that it paints of the betrothal period. So anyway, so my question, and I'm driving to something here. If in fact the word Isha is used there, and you said that you typically would just grant marriage because for the sake of argument, but it got me thinking. I was like, maybe we shouldn't grant that so quickly, because if in fact they were married, then the slave owner would no longer have rights over her, because now the rights would belong to him, as the marriage would have consummated that. So in some sense, he still must own something of her that he hasn't given over to the husband yet, because they're still in the betrothal period, not in the marriage period. So, and I don't know if I'm making myself clear here. I may be using a few confusing terms here, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. Because if in fact they were married, would not they have the right to then walk away after he paid the debt for the family? But as it stands, it sounds like he's just there for his use. The master gave it to him so that he would give him something to entice him to stick around. Am I making any sense what I'm saying?
I don't know that we know a lot about the finer differences in the betrothal versus an actual marriage on the basis of the text that we have. I think a lot of this we have a tendency to project backwards on the basis of cultural conventions that were much later. So I'll say this, unlike Josh, I am less I'm less likely to concede the point. Oh, did I say something?
No.
Okay.
You were just, that was very diplomatic of you.
Oh, Thanks. I'm
Josh
much
is
less.
such a people pleaser.
It's true though, right? Like I'm
Get it.
much less likely to concede this point. I do tend to think that we have a romanticized view, an inappropriately modern view of the coupling relationships between men and women as they appear throughout the Hebrew Bible, as they reflect uh, ancient Israelite or Judean and even later Jewish uh, cultures, in the sense that these were these were not in all practicality uh equal relationships, right? Women, as I've written a little bit on this, women within uh this ancient culture, as near as we can see it depicted in the biblical texts, were basically under the authority of a man in every stage of their life. So a woman was born into a household and was effectively the responsibility, um the I hesitate to say property, but uh she was her father's, and then she passed from him into the household of the man, whomever she was coupled with, probably in a relationship in which she didn't really, it certainly wasn't required for her to have any sort of consent or say in this. Maybe she did, but there certainly wasn't any requirement for that. And she would stay in that situation until, if he passed away before she did, then she was passed along to her, hopefully at this time, grown sons, right? Or into, the custody of a brother
Bro,
or
right,
an uncle, or another man
right, right,
is needed
right.
to look after her,
Yeah.
basically. But these were predominantly relationships that were made for economic reasons.
Well, and I think that was the point I was making. I didn't want to get
Yeah,
too far off track.
it's
I was trying to make a connection, and the connection I was making was from what I understand of the betrothal laws, and like you said, there's not a whole lot that we gather. A lot of it's from implication. But the only point I was making was it sounds like there was neither a betrothal nor a marriage that took place with that
mm,
particular slave, but rather it was just a woman given to this dude to keep
yeah,
him around because he enjoyed the luxury of having a woman. And then over time, he falls in love with her and wants to stay. Had it been either a betrothal or a marriage, it sounds to me from the betrothal laws or the marriage laws that at that point she would have been his property, not the slave owner's
right,
property. So I
So
guess that
right.
was the only point I was making. But
Yeah,
so
yeah,
the
yeah.
thing that we
Okay.
it's kind of
the
a
thing
major
that we
sidetrack.
the thing that we do have to consider, and like I think there's something to what you're saying here. We
Yeah.
do have to consider that slave marriages were different
Mm,
from free person marriages. So
That's
I've got
also
a
fascinating.
that's true.
I've
Yeah.
got a section on it. I divided up all the slave laws. I have translations of all the slave laws from the ancient Near
And
East
that
and the
probably
Hebrew
makes
Bible
sense
in
as
here.
to why you're granting it, because you clearly know more about it. So
Well, no, I mean, but here, this is the laws of Ornama 4. So these come from the end of the third millennium. So again, these are Sumerian laws, but I think there's a commonality in the legal system here. If a slave marries a slave girl of his choice, and this slave is set free, she will not leave the household. So, um, that we have this idea of like marriage being binary, right? You're married or you're not married, right? And
Hmm.
and that there's one kind of wife. There's like a wife, or that's it, right? Um, it is much more. There's much finer gradation in. There's a spectrum. It's a spectrum in of marriage. So you can have slave wife, you can have concubine, you can have like a semi-free wife. Like they're all sorts of things. And the way that you sort of get at what kind of a wife is being described in a particular case is what happens. So you're hitting it, right? Wait a second. Shouldn't she go free? Well, I mean, it's because of the status of the individuals that are involved. I will say this: Bernard Jackson has made a pretty good case that the two sets of laws in the first part of Exodus 21, the one about the male debt slave and the female debt slave, they're both being used for their sexual capacities. That's the point. They're both being used for their sexual capacities. So in 2 to 6, the master wants more slaves. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So can you just for a moment, because this is going to be a part of this discussion anyway tonight, and I feel like this is a really good transition period, because I want to talk about this, and I'm going to tell you what this is here, and then I want to come back again and retrack our steps, because we need to talk about chattel slavery. We need to talk about and refute progressive revelation. This whole idea, it's this ridiculous idea that God's just working with people, because there's so many problems with that. So we'll come back to that in a second. But right now, you said women being used as property. And that is a very important thing, because you can probably cover this, or Kipp can. I don't care which one of you two, because either one of you, I'm sure, can eloquently deal with this. But there's passages, or at least a passage, that specifically says when you go in and you destroy everybody, take the women for yourselves. There's even pedophilia ideas, leave the women, men, and boys, just take the little girls. It's sick when you see that passage, but we won't even touch with pedophilia tonight. We'll just stick with the bondage of women in general. But you had the right to just take them and own them and try them out for a few days, and then if you didn't like them, you get to send them away. Why don't you guys want to? Josh has been talking a while. Why don't you take this one? Or Josh, I'm sorry. I don't.
What do you? No, I was just. I mean, I guess. Is there a question that
you want me to just
or
no, not a question. I just wanted you guys to elaborate on that for the people listening.
On just the
text itself.
These sorts of relationships that are depicted. What's often called
the way women were used as property, like this sexually, as Josh was talking about.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's and that's. I mean, I think that that's what we're dealing with on a broad scale here is that a woman in antiquity, a lot of her own identity is just tied up in her sexual capacity. I mean, that's just it. Women are a woman's value is predicated on her ability and her capacity to bear children, to have offspring. And there's a couple different ways. Maybe I'll go in a little bit of a different direction here. There's a couple of different ways in which we can see this from within the text itself. One of the things that I occasionally point to is the just pulling up the word itself when in Genesis chapter 1, when it talks about the creation of the man and creation of humanity. It says that in 1:27, God created the man in his image and in his likeness, in the image and likeness of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So the word for male in Hebrew is zakar. The root of zakar is a verb which basically means to name or to remember. The word for female in Hebrew is nikavah, and the root of the word nikavah is a verb that means, or I should say, sorry, the masculine form of that word is nekev, which just means hole. It's like a hole in the ground, right? And this is a point that was made by, um, shoot, I'm gonna. It might have been Susan Haddocks, who was a feminist theologian. That there's something visceral about this difference in terms of just the etymological import of these ideas. That a man, maleness was distinguished by your 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 ability to pass on your own legacy, your own memory. Woman was distinguished as basically the receptacle of that. So that's one. The other one that sometimes I draw attention to is this story in Genesis chapter 18 and 19. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's an interesting feature that we probably just move on past when we read this story in Genesis chapter 18. Yahweh arrives with two other divine companions at Abram's tent, and he puts them up. He prepares a meal for them. He extends his hospitality to them. Here at the end of here in Genesis 18, verse 11, he's said that or just before Yahweh, it's a famous story. Just before Yahweh tells a very old Sarah that she's going to have a child, he says this. He says, I'll return to you at the time of life, and you will see Sarah, your woman, have a son. He says this to Abraham. Sarah overheard this in the tent door, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. And then it says this about Sarah. Sarah was no longer in the way of women. So this is the customary expression. Most of your English translations will just say Sarah was barren, or she was past child rearing years, right? But I mean, just think about the way that expression occurs in Hebrew.
Wow.
She was no longer in the way of women. She's not even a woman anymore. The perspective here is that once you're no longer able to have children, I mean, what are you? It's and I've got this open here. Maybe I'll just read this. This is an idiom used to say that Sarah was no longer menstruating as women do. Sarah was no longer in the way of women. I leave it in its literal sense because I think forms of speech are especially useful for communicating to us an aspect of the worldview of the text. In this case, Sarah's menopause is depicted as a departure from the function of women. It was their way. This relays some of the utility that women were afforded in the ancient world. Their value was realized in their capability to give birth to children. In her old age, Sarah is no longer functional as a woman because she has advanced past her utility. And without ever having born children, this is an especially uninviting situation to be found. In essence, Sarah has become a useless woman, an old woman who can no longer bear children, who has never borne children, is probably the worst state someone within this culture could have discovered themselves to be. And the reason for that is because this is just an inherent view of a woman's identity. It was very much tied up in this idea that you are a receptacle for producing offspring. So, oh,
Wow. Dude, that passage, I never saw it like that. That's unbelievable.
well, most English translations don't translate it.
Yeah,
well.
dude, like I don't clearly. Jeez, man.
And
Josh,
I
you
think,
want to pick up on that? Go ahead.
yeah, and because I think that sets a really good backdrop for the passage you're describing, right? Because in Deuteronomy 20,
Yeah.
you have the rules of warfare. And the text has two groups of people in mind that the Israelites are going to be fighting. One, the people that are in Canaan, and the rules are pretty clear there. They're gone. You just take them out.
Get rid of them.
But then you have those cities that are said to be afar off. And there's some nuance to that, right? There's a process. In very good ancient Near Eastern thought, when a particular nation has power and can, enforce their will upon other nations, what they do is they will very often offer them vassalage. It's a lot easier financially and with manpower. It's just a lot easier to keep vassals in check than it is to actually try to create this broad country, right? And we see this with the Assyrians time and again. So this is what the text is sort of depicting, that the Israelites are supposed to march up against a city that's afar off and offer them shalom, which is the Hebrew word for peace, which amounts to vassalage. And they're to say, like, open up your gates. Well, we won't attack you. And if they do, then all of the people in that city are subject to what's called mas. It's corvée labor. We see this in 1 Kings 9 with Solomon. He musters a bunch of foreigners to come do his work, the actual forced labor. However, if that city puts up a fight, then they are to emasculate, just kill all the men, and the women and the children, the livestock, the goods, all that stuff becomes the plunder of the nation of Israel, of the force. And it's in this context that we have Deuteronomy 21, 10-14. And the text says, if a man sees among the captives, these are the people that put up a fight, got emasculated, bringing the captives back home, the people, the goods. If a man sees a very beautiful woman among the captives and desires to have her as a wife, then this is the process. He's to bring her into his home, cut her nails, shave her head, and she's to change out of her clothing that she was wearing as a captive. She's supposed to put on different clothing. And she's to be given 30 days to mourn her dead family. And then the text says, and afterwards you may go in unto her. And that idiom, go in unto her, is used as it's not only like a sexual idiom, right? It's what you do when you go have sex with somebody. You can go into her, you will be her husband, she will be your wife. But then the text says, if she is no longer pleasing to you, you cannot sell her. You can't trade with her, like you can't use her as a bargaining chip or something, and you can't sell her because you have the text there uses this form of the verb.
This tricky word.
Yeah, it means to devalue someone by having intercourse with them. To devalue them by having intercourse. You've
de-virginized her, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, and it's again as horrific as this was. Like this is how people thought in the ancient Near East, as Kipp was talking about. Their sexual capacity is what brings them value. So, the way they're thinking is once you drive the car off the lot,
yeah,
And
Yeah,
that's
I mean, what do they think it means? Well, if you're no longer pleased with her, what do you think that means?
yeah, right. And this is you see this in Exodus 21, 7-11 as well. So but what's supposed to happen there is you're supposed to let her go wherever she wants. The text says to herself, right? Whatever she wants to do, she can go there because you have defiled her,
Yeah, you've
dishonored
taken
her,
away her
deflowered her.
value for somebody else.
Yes,
It's
that's
done.
right.
Yeah, you've
That's right.
ruined her.
So, the question is, I mean, obviously in this context, there is no such thing as consent, right? That wasn't something that they would have considered in that context. Certainly, even from our modern vantage point, like she can't consent. She's a captive. She's under duress.
It sounds an awful lot like you're saying slavery, Josh.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what they were, right? I mean, the people that are coming back, they are plunder, right? And so here, what's happening, what I think, and there are other scholars that think this. This is not a hill that I would necessarily die on, but it makes good sense to me. The underlying reason, even if the text isn't intending it this way, the underlying rationale for the 30-day period is in my opinion to see if she's going to like have a menstruation. She's not pregnant is the idea. So if you're taking a captive woman, the law here is to ensure that this law in all likelihood is intended to answer the question, can I have a legitimate heir? How do I have a legitimate heir for the captive bride? That's what the text is answering. If you want to have a legitimate heir with a captive bride, here's how you do it. Right. And so yeah, like I think that in this context, she's not a full wife in the sense that you might see like another wife being taken, like a Rachel or a Leah or something like that. Yet it's not strictly a slave wife, because you have to have terms at the end, like you can't just sell her. Like if this were a regular marriage, you can't just sell your wife like that, right? It doesn't work that way. That doesn't mean that during the marriage, a man couldn't say use his wife as a pledge, right? Put her in the house of a creditor as a pledge or something. But in other words, and this is there's a whole section if people are interested. There's a book called The Mishpatim by Bernard Jackson. It's got a lengthy section on this. It's very nuanced. It's pretty complicated. Like, what are the statuses of women, these wives, in passages like Exodus 21, 7-11, Deuteronomy 21, 10-14? Like, what are we looking at here? And the answer is, it's like, it's complicated, right? That would be the status on their Facebook page. Just kidding. It's complicated what's going on here. That's I don't mean that to sound funny, or to make light of this. Yeah, that's what's happening here, and that's the difficulty. So this is what we would consider, not them, by our edit categories. Looking back on this, we would say that this is sex slavery. There's no question about that. These captive women, like that, there is no thank you.
Yeah.
Right. That I don't wish to be your wife. Right.
Right.
No, thank you.
But it gets worse than that, though. And it's everything you just described. Like, once a woman is used, she's useless, essentially, is what we were saying a few minutes ago. And so, or at least in that call, and for the cause that the woman is supposed to be for, the virgin and producing a child or whatever. So this passage has every implication that the women that you are taking as property have never been married before either, which would also imply in that culture that these were young girls, probably 12 years old, maybe a little bit older if you're lucky, because they got married pretty young in that culture, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, certainly younger than today.
Yeah. So when you think about it, this doesn't sound too much different than Numbers 31, because I mean, I said I wasn't going to deal with pedophilia, but we're on the subject, so I'm just going to read it. Numbers 31, starting in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. And then he's got a whole bunch of other stuff. But in verse 7, they fought against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every man. Jump to verse 14. Moses was angry with the officers of the army who returned from the battle. He asked, have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them, now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man. Now you got dead men, you got dead boys, you got dead women. What's left? But save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man.
How do they make that discovery in the first place, right?
I mean, what exactly are these little girls useful for that the boys, men, and women aren't? I wonder. This is some sick stuff, and this is the command of the Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like certainly not to sound like an apologist here. That's not what I'm intending here. If we're coming to the text saying this is a divinely inspired document that is infallible and inerrant, and these are the commands of an all-loving God, we got some real problems, in my opinion, right? However, if we're not approaching it that way, if we're approaching it as a product of its time, this is not, by their standards, in any way egregious.
Perfect. That is the best transition we could possibly have into progressive revelation, because that is the chief argument from the apologist side. Well, but God's just dealing with people in sin and free will or whatever you name it, and he's progressively helping them become better over time. That's a really important argument that people use. And I mean, right out the gate, the biggest problem I see with that argument is, let's say I'm an Israelite and I happen to have a better moral code than this, and I value women more than God apparently does. And I don't think that we should beat our slaves. And I have all these, and let's just say I'm Marty McFly and I travel back to the past in the Doc's time machine, and I land in Israel, and here I am, and I have the moral code that I have today, and I read this law that God has given Israel to supposedly help them progress in their righteousness and stop, being as bad as everybody else. Would that law help me progress in morality, or would that make me immoral if I felt compelled to obey God's law after already thinking that stuff was immoral? See, this is the problem I have with this progressive revelation thing. That does not make you more moral. It makes you immoral.
Yeah, I think so. There are several hurdles, obviously, that this argument needs to overcome. And Kipp, I've been chatting, so jump in. You will not offend me in the slightest. The big one that I see here is a very practical one, and that is show me, right? Show me the progress. It's not enough to hypothetically. So I had somebody tell me this week. I asked them I am not making this up. I asked them the question. Look, the laws of Hammurabi from the middle of the 18th century BCE limit the amount of time that a master creditor can keep a debt slave to 3 years. Can't keep him for longer than 3 years. Is that more moral or less moral than Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15 that say you can keep them for 6 years, right? And I'm not kidding. This person said, well, it's possible that God knew that this was really bad for the economy and therefore really creating other moral problems in the land. Uh, that only because 3 years just wasn't enough time to pay back the debt. And so God knew that ultimately this would be more moral overall for the people. And it's like, oh, okay. As stupid as that sounds on its face, it's not enough, if I'm being incredibly generous, it's not enough to just say, maybe that's the case. If this is going to stick in any way, you have to sort of show that to be the case, right? And so it's not enough to say, well, God was incrementally moving people forward by giving, as moral or more moral laws about slavery. Like you have to show that, and that's the first big hurdle that you have to overcome. And that was one of the points of the book, was to do this kind of comparative analysis with the ancient Near Eastern law collections and to show, look, just like with laws on adultery, just like with laws on rape, so also with slavery, like they're just sort of on par with the rest of the ancient Near East. And you have to show your homework, right? It's not enough to just say this could be why God did it. That doesn't mean anything.
Dude, I love that you used a specific example, because I get so tired of people trying to, oh yeah, Israel, it was so much more lenient in Israel. You just made a case where it wasn't.
Right.
It's absurd. And here's, I mean, like, and by that argument, well, because of the culture, and maybe it was more important that for the economy, that, I mean, okay, that would be like, well, for the society, when women were getting out of control, we needed to make sure we kept them more in control. So in Israel, we decided to beat our women 6 days a week instead of 3 days a week, because the society needed it.
Yep.
What a silly argument.
Yeah. And it pushes, it creates a conundrum for the apologist too, right? Because out of the one side of their mouth, they want to argue that that there is this incremental improvement within Israelite culture. It's like, look, you can only keep your slaves for 6 years, and then you have to let them go. You can't keep them forever. And when you point out to them, well, this is not an incremental improvement over some of these other comparative ancient Near Eastern law codes, invariably you start to enter, the waffling then tends to go to, well, it was actually a pretty good situation for a lot of these people. They're poor, they're struggling to survive on their own, so they get to stay longer, and they get things provided for them while they're in this. So maybe 6 years is better. I don't know.
That's why that woman in 2 Kings 4 was so excited.
So excited.
Her kids were going to go into debt slavery.
That's it, right? It's such, and I'm just I'm gonna come back to this point that I made at the start, right? This feels like the hill that that so many Christian apologists have recognized they have to die on. They can't give an inch. They can't concede on what the text actually says, to the point that they have to twist themselves into ridiculous pretzels and perform the most insane gymnastics to compensate for what is just plainly obvious in the text. And it's because slavery is evil, just on the face of it. And the Bible is a text that rather explicitly endorses slavery. It's just that simple.
It's just that simple. And Kipp, before I jump on to the next thing, can you just give the most brief and simple definition of slavery you can, so we can distinguish it from this silliness of it's an employee-employer relationship. Can you help
See,
us with that?
that's so yeah, I mean,
Do you want me to
Josh,
read?
Or,
Do you want me to
or
read
God, I don't
do
mine?
care, one
that
of you.
because yeah. I mean,
Um,
I will, yeah.
I've thought
No,
about this a lot.
Oh,
you
I'm
Um,
sure
have.
you did.
so because like, and Kip, how about I read mine and you, if you want, you can say, yeah, like I disagree with this, or I would nuance it this way or
Sure.
whatever. Um, so yeah, a condition in which an individual or rights to their labor is owned by another, either temporarily or permanently. The owner controls and is legally allowed to derive benefit from the actions and activities of the owned individual. Now, that definition is meant to cover debt and chattel slavery.
I think it
So
was perfect.
Yeah.
before people get all, because I actually typed this in a recent conversation Alan and I were having, and they jumped all over. Oh, you said rights to their labor. Yes, that's what debt slavery is, right?
Exactly.
So yeah. Anyway,
So,
that's how I would.
just
And let's be
FYI,
clear there
anybody,
too.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, let's be clear there too, because I think sometimes, and you've touched on this a little bit earlier, Alan, that this gets lost on people. That doesn't, in this situation, that there are no stipulations or conditions on what kind of labor you can have your slave perform for you. That's completely open-ended. There's no there's no rules with regards to how many hours in the day they can or can't work, or at what time of the day. Do you have to give them a lunch break? Do you have to ensure that they are in a safe working environment? These sorts of things that we generally tend to concoct in our imaginations on the basis of the society in which we live now, where there are rules for how you can treat people who work for you. Within a debt slave relationship, there's none of that. Like, it's just when it says that you own, and let's say when it says that you own their labor or their output, it's like it's all of it, right? Like, you're entitled to all of it for this duration, for this period of time. Um, I feel like very often that gets lost.
I agree. It very often does get lost. Um, and the whole idea of this progressive revelation just, oh my goodness, I get so frustrated by the argument because, maybe if God, who transcends space and time, could actually figure out back in the Old Testament that maybe I should just give a law that slavery is wrong, because I could clearly tell them not to wear polyester and cotton together. I figured that one out, but I couldn't figure out that beating people is wrong and owning them is wrong. And also, for the kind and generous person who says, I just don't want to own somebody, and I want to, I just want to forgive them of their debt without making them pay me. But God's law says I should do it this way. Now I'm going against my own conscience and doing what I think is wrong, but God says it's right, and I'm a theist, and I have to obey God, and I'm one of His people. So now I'm retracting. I'm going backwards in morality. It's a horrible concept, and in fact, maybe if God would have just fixed it back then, maybe we wouldn't have even had Southern American slavery. Because all the reasons you said, Josh, earlier, you think about it, where did they get the idea of slavery?
Yeah.
The Bible, right? Christians, and I get this all the time too. Well, Christians are the reason slavery was abolished. They helped for sure, but it was because they were fixing their own freaking mess.
Right, and
Well,
that's that. And if I just very quickly, because on this point, there's a stack of books downstairs that I've been going through on this topic. This slavery debate in the antebellum South, and what were the pro and the pro slavery and the abolitionist arguments. And when you look at Not that this is my area of expertise. Just put that out there. But it seems consistent that when you look at what pro-slavery Christian arguments were, they were utilizing the standard hermeneutical approach to the text. And so when a pastor or preacher, would preach a sermon on the topic of slavery, they would read a text, they would exegete it, right? And then they would give, some application. And scholars are pointing out when you read through these texts that abolitionists, Christians who are fighting against slavery, they're doing so not from these passages as much as from reading something like Genesis 1, 26 and 27, Leviticus 19, 33 and 34, and then talking about freedom in Christ, right? And they're not utilizing the actual texts about slavery, right? Instead, they're talking in these broader principles and approaching what I dare say and what these scholars are referring to as a more progressive form of Christian thought. So the abolitionists sound like they were kind of liberal. Ruh-roh.
Yeah, this is Christianity made a contribution to ending slavery within the Christian world, because who else was there to do it there, right? It's a silly argument because it fails to recognize that it just couldn't have been any other way, not because of Christianity, but because this is the framework within which they were functioning, and they found their way through it through a variety of reasons. And I point this out a fair bit, that if there is such a strong movement just within the pages of Scripture towards this ethic of freedom and liberty and the abolition of slavery, then it certainly is curious that nobody for hundreds of years, thousands of years, thought to employ the idea of the image of God to this question until, well into the at least the medieval period, and never even really caught on until the 18th or the 19th century. You certainly don't have biblical authors ever talking about the image of God in their conversations about slavery. You certainly don't see that in any text of early Judaism, and we have lots and lots of those. It's not remotely clear that that there's any sort of progression here. It just isn't.
Yeah, thank you for all that insight. That's very, very helpful. This is a fun subject. We could talk all night. There's just a couple last things we need to wrap up, because I think we're getting there. I think we've pretty much covered the gambit. I do want to do my bookend at the end, and I'll do that later. One of the issues that I said people struggle with is, well, you atheists, you don't have any standard of morality, so you can't possibly judge God. There's not enough time in one episode to deal with the subject of morality. I'm going to be doing a special on my on the Unraveler show here in the next couple of days, specifically on morality. I covered it in my book too, quite extensively. But yes, I am going to demonstrate that being a non-theist actually makes far more sense for morality than being a theist. You actually can't have morality any more than you can as an atheist if you're a theist. It's nonsensical. But I will demonstrate that in another episode. So be sure to subscribe right now if you're here so that you don't miss that or any other episodes that I have, because we have great discussions just like this one all the time on a regular basis each week. So please subscribe, be a part of this channel. But two last things that we need to cover before we wrap up is my book, and maybe Josh has something else, it sounds like. But I do want to turn it over to you, Josh, because I want you to specifically deal with chattel slavery, demonstrate that in Israel, because that is a hinge pin. So many Christians try to excuse, well, yeah, but at least it wasn't chattel slavery. Yes, it was. But say whatever else you had on your mind just now when you went, and then
you know, and here's the thing, like, and I think this is what people miss, because I get this question a fair amount. Got it recently, as you know, Alan. And first of all, when people ask me that question, it's usually that what they think is a get out of jail free card. Right? They've come up to the line of scrimmage. You know, they didn't realize that the opposing team, you know, actually had some players out there that could push back against them, and they called an audible. And the audible is, yeah, but how do you even ground your morality?
Right.
How can you even say that slavery is wrong? And my response to that is always, if you want to debate, you know, like the philosophy of ethics, go find a philosopher of ethics. My job here in these spaces is, as an Assyriologist that minored in Hebrew Bible, right? My job as an ancient Near Eastern specialist is to say, what does that text say? And what does it mean in its broader context? If you want to go have discussions, not you, Alan, but if somebody wants to go have discussions about whether it's moral or not, I mean, live your best life. If you're asking my personal opinion, I'm going to say rape is wrong, murder is wrong, slavery is wrong. And you can say to me, oh, so you don't have any grounding for the necessary preconditionals of immoral. And I'm going to say, guess what I do at night with all of that? Right? I sleep super well, not knowing why rape is wrong. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with it. I don't lie awake and like, oh my God, why is raping someone? Oh my God, I don't even, what if, like, nope. I live a very good life just starting there, right? So, if that's the flex you want, hey, like, you got to take them when you can get them, I guess.
Right. Well, on that note, though, this show initially was supposed to be you and I debating Lance Connolly and William Vincent. That show went south behind the scenes, unfortunately. It was, I don't really understand why it went south. It was just dialogue, and it didn't seem like they wanted to contend with the material you're presenting. And hopefully they and others can see there is nothing to contend with this material. We're not just spewing opinions. You guys have literally done nothing but spew facts from the text itself and the Hebrew literature and the Hebrew words. So it floors me when Christians think that they have some arguments to defend slavery and the morality of God in slavery, or pedophilia, as I demonstrated tonight. So we have just problems all around with Christianity defending God and his Hebrew laws in so many different ways. But that being said, I will throw out the challenge that if you have watched this show and you still think you have some sort of an argument against us in demonstrating that God is still good in promoting slavery, okay, let us know. Josh and I, or Kipp and I, or Josh and Kipp, or one combination of us, we'll be glad to discuss it with you, depending on what it is you're wishing to argue. If it's a morality thing, I'll definitely be there, because it sounds like I'm the one who loves to discuss that one. But I would use one of you, Josh or Kipp, to help me to solidify the logistics of the laws. Then that'll be perfect. So if you want to be my guest, come on, and we will have this conversation with you publicly. But I certainly hope that you see that you are actually way out in left field if you think that there's some kind of argument that's going to defend God in this. It is just an immoral issue.
Very rarely, Alan, and I know this is true of Kipp, very rarely do I have a Christian apologist say to me, yes, and it happens, and it can be scary, but they very rarely say to us, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it was chattel slavery. Yeah, people are owned as property. Yeah, Proverbs 29, yeah, that advocates masters to beat their slaves in order to make sure that they're obedient or do the right thing or stay motivated. Yeah, people are owned as property and passed on as inheritance. Yeah, children are born into slavery, lifelong slavery. Yeah, that's all those things are true. I just think that because God said it, they're moral, right?
Right.
And once they say that, I go, I don't know if I'd say that in
Right.
public, right? But we are in public, so don't say it really loud. I don't know.
Becoming increasingly more and more acceptable to say such things.
But that's the thing. I go, okay, well, I'm not a philosopher of ethics, so like getting down to grounding my moral positions or something, like that's not what I got my PhD in. There are people that did, so I leave
that's
that
fair.
to them.
And that's fair. I mean, and as a preview to what I'm going to be discussing in my episode, I mean, it's really this simple. How do you know that God is moral? It's a real simple question. The only reason you think God is moral is because you decided that you think his morality is what you want. Like it's not like you are just a robot sitting down and saying, well, God's moral because I said he's moral. If you're living like that, you literally are a robot. But if you think God's moral because he follows your code of morality, then that's the reason you think his law is moral. Your reason for choosing God's morality is no different from mine choosing humanism as a moral code. Like, I just value humanity, and genuinely you're doing the same thing. You're just ascribing it to a God because you're brainwashed to believe a God exists. And that's the only reason that you're using him as a transcendent standard. But your reason for believing that these things are wrong or evil is the same as mine. So I'm going to deal with that in another episode, like I said, but you can't just walk around saying, well, I just follow God's law. No, you don't. You follow God's law because you chose it as the best law. Otherwise, you're literally a robot. Like and that's
a good segue.
What's that?
I think that I was going to say, I think that's a good segue into answering your, because I dodged and obfuscated on your chattel slavery question. But I think this is where most people will say, thank God, that like the reason that they're trying to push back that there was chattel slavery in the Hebrew Bible is because they know it's wrong, right? Thank God they know that,
right?
And so that's why they're pushing back. What I have always hoped is that what I'm getting ready to say about the presence of chattel slavery in the Hebrew Bible and the law collections is that they would go, shit, I didn't realize that. Maybe I should rethink how I'm viewing those texts, right? Maybe I need to rethink how I frame those. Unfortunately, there are people that don't, and they just say, "Oh, well, I guess it's not so bad then." But what you see by the time you get to the holiness code in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, is you see, as we were talking about earlier, and actually, Kipp, you should probably talk through this, because there's a contrast in 39 to 43 and 44 to 46. And that contrast is between Israel as God's slaves and non-Israelites who are not God's slaves. And so then they are available to be the slaves of Israel. Do you want to cover that, Kipp? Because I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
And then there's also Deuteronomy. There's also Deuteronomy 25, which is pretty explicit.
Yeah.
So
basically, it's this.
By the time you Leviticus 25. Sorry,
Leviticus 25. Yeah.
Yes.
So by the time you get to Leviticus 25, this is most scholars see this as the latest of the three law collections, and they are sort of responding in one way or another to the former two. And if you remember, in the former two law collections, Israelites are allowed to be kept as debt slaves for up to 6 years and have to be released in the seventh. here in Leviticus 25, the text says, if on the progression of greater poverty to a greater poverty, a fellow Israelite ultimately has to sell himself to you, or is sold to you. It's debated which one it should be. You are not to make him serve as a slave, the work of a slave specifically. Instead, you are to treat him as a hired worker and a resident alien among you, or a tenant farmer among you, and he will live with you until the year of Jubilee, at which time he will be released back to his property, and all his property be returned to him. The text says, because the Israelites are my slaves, they are not to be sold in the sale of a slave.
So there's another, before Josh continues, there's another important feature in there that I think is critical to this discussion. You'll also notice that in Leviticus 25, so much of this is tied to the relationship between the sons of Israel, Yahweh, and the land in which they, are supposedly occupying after having kicked all the Canaanites out, which is something that never happened. But that's the what's surrounding this discussion in this text, and something that we see stated explicitly here is that Yahweh owns all the land as well, but has basically provided it to the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, his slaves, essentially. He's given this to them, basically to look after as if it's their own. And because they also don't own the land, there are special conditions on what they can do with the land. For example, something that they're not allowed to do with the land is to sell the land to foreigners. You can't do that because it's not yours. And in so doing, it also prevents someone else from, basically taking part in their inheritance, in their, they're no longer allowed to participate in this benevolent gifting of God to his slaves to look after his land. So, like, for that reason, this is why it's necessary. This is why the rule is in place for the sons of Israel to go back to their tribal allotments once they're finished. Once the year of Jubilee comes, everyone goes back. Essentially, all the property gets reset. Right, everything is restored into the allotments that were stipulated by Yahweh in the first place. These are all temporary relationships, but this is one of the reasons why you're allowed to have foreign slaves and to keep them in perpetuity, is because they have no land rights. There is nothing for them to go back to. There's no restoration that's needed there. There's nothing to be factored into this important, careful balance that's being maintained between Yahweh, his people, and the land.
And that's why in 44 to 46, the text in this sort of parenthetical section considers, all right, if you're not allowed to keep fellow Israelites as slaves, from where do you get them?
Mm-hmm.
And so it says, as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may buy male and female slaves. Sorry, sort of close quoting it here, but or rough quoting it here. You may also purchase some of the Toshavim, who are like the tenant farmers that are living in the land, and from their descendants, from their children that have been born after them. These you may keep as achuzah, and the word achuzah there is the same word that is used to
Oh, it's the
identify.
same word to describe God, right, Josh?
Yeah,
So
that's
it's good.
that's right.
Very
So
good.
it can't be
Love it.
bad.
Sorry.
Sorry, a little inside joke there. And so it's the same term that is used to describe landed property in the rest of Leviticus 25. These can be passed on as inheritance to your children after you, and these you may make serve forever, olam. But then it says, but as for your fellow Israelites, your brethren, the children of Israel, you're not allowed to make them serve in violence or with rigor, or however you want to translate that. So these are, by definition, chattel slaves, right? In other words, they are. There is no release requirement. They are owned as property. They are passed on as inheritance
for life.
For life.
Life.
So, you know, this is one of the two places that I think is very clear examples of the people that are owned in perpetuity in the law collections. This in Exodus 21:2-6 with the woman and the children.
Yes.
And of course, the man can sign up for that as well. So it's kind of tough to get around.
Essentially, what's going on? So whenever Israel goes through, and as long as they don't destroy a nation and kill everybody in it, they can buy chattel slaves from it, men, women, children, whatever. And then if they do destroy a nation, kill all the men, women, and boys, save the girls for yourself, make them your slaves, use them up as you wish. If you don't like them anymore, send them off, but you can't sell them because they're useless to anybody else. That's essentially the long and short of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would nuance it in different ways. Like I do think that the law is in place, just like in all the other ancient Near Eastern law collections, that the law is in place to protect the vulnerable party in a transaction. But that's the key.
I mean, is it though? It sounds like with chattel slavery, it's there to protect the owner, not the vulnerable party.
Well, in the case that's true. In the case of Leviticus 25, the vulnerable party would be in this sense the buyer, right? Because the text is saying you don't have to release them. There is no requirement for you to release them. So that's true. But in that case, the law is still protecting the vulnerable party. It's just the vulnerable party, according to their lights,
not the most vulnerable party necessarily.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not much different than the law in Deuteronomy 24, you know, because Jesus touches on this when he talks about, you know, Moses gave them, you know, to not divorce their wives or whatever, or a certificate of divorce. I mean, that if you go back to Deuteronomy 24, you realize that that's actually intended to protect the women at that point, because men were just like divorcing their wives, passing them on, then want them back. And so a lot of people misunderstand that text, and it's about, you know, that you know, Moses is trying to protect the men. He's not. He's protecting the women in that case. And so yeah, I mean, because otherwise they were just being passed around, and that was not acceptable. So there are some cases in which the women do get protected, but it seems that only happens within, if you're an Israelite. If you're outside of Israel, you don't seem to have any protection rights.
Well, and this is the thing, like, and we can like, I can wrap up the stuff that I need to say with this, because it's a passage that comes up that we should deal with. Deuteronomy 23:15-16, or 16-17 in Hebrew. This is something that gets pulled out quite a bit by Christian apologists, saying, look, if a slave runs away, you can't return them, right? You're not allowed to return them. So essentially, no matter what you think about the slave laws, if a slave can get away, that's it, right? They don't have to go back. They're not to be returned. The problem with this analysis of the text is that most scholars, when they analyze this passage, they think that this is referring to foreign slaves that are escaping from foreign nations into Israel. And that's a very important distinction. And it fits well with the broader context of the book of Deuteronomy. And again, I have a lengthy section about it in the book, but there are the whole book of Deuteronomy is sort of predicated on this broad Neo-Assyrian treaty treaty format, and one of the things that it's really emphasizing is how to ensure that Israel becomes the head and not the tail, as the text itself says. So how to do that? How to ensure that Israel stays as the one in power? I'm blanking. That they're the ones that have the vassals, right? As opposed to being the vassals
Suzerains.
themselves. That's right, suzerain. So, thank you. And so, one of the things that you see in ancient Near Eastern treaties is extradition clauses. And an extradition clause is okay with a parity treaty. You know, if our slaves escape to you, you know, you return them to us, and if they escape to us, we return them back to you. If you have a vassal, then you might have a clause in there, and you probably would have a clause that, hey, if our slaves escape to you, you better damn well return them to us. But you wouldn't have one saying it if you come to us, you know, because they're your vassal. And so probably what this law is trying to do is ensure that Israel isn't setting up this like either a parity or a vassal treaty on themselves. That's what it's sort of speaking against here. Because if you think about, well, anyway, we won't have to go into it. But if people are interested in a more lengthy discussion with bibliography on who's written about this, you know, I've got it in the book. So,
Josh, do you think that might have some bearing on what Paul was doing with Philemon?
Oh, I don't know. So that's Philemon is tricky. And again, I'm not a New Testament scholar, so just given the research that I had to do for the book, you know, Philemon it's not clear what's going on in Philemon. I assume when I write that section on Philemon, I'm assuming like a best case scenario for the apologist that it actually is about a runaway slave. Right, but that does not seem to be at all clear. For subject matter experts, that's specifically what's going on here, which is interesting in and of itself. But I like, you know, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to walk away from the book of Philemon saying this is some broad condemnation of the social institution of slavery. Like, that's a bizarre take.
I mean, like if it was an abolition, like it would have been really helpful if Paul sent Philemon back to Onesimus and said, hey, Onesimus back to Paul, Philemon. Hey, you know, this guy ran away or didn't, whichever the case is, but he was useful to me. Now he's useful to you, whatever. Don't take it. But hey, Philemon, I have another idea. Why don't you just not have any slaves at all? Because it's a really bad idea. It's you know what I mean? Like that would have been helpful.
Yeah.
That would have been really
of all people.
Right. If anybody.
The whole argument about like, look, Paul is telling them, look, and I agree with this, by the way, that the Paul is not, and Jesus, that like they're not suggesting uprisings, right? Like I agree with that. Not that it's my field, but like Philemon's a friendly,
right?
Right? Like, hey. Between us, we know that slavery's bad, so don't keep him, right? Okay.
You would think, because I get this argument too. Well, you know, in the new covenant it changes, although I've yet to see where.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Where does the New Testament condemn slavery?
You know, and it might actually make things so the oftentimes you know, apologists will draw attention to Galatians. Is it Galatians 5?
Oh, you're talking about the text, no more women, no more male or female.
Yeah, male and female.
Okay,
So,
what do you mean by that argument? Then that means we don't have women and men anymore, or male and female.
Yeah, exactly. But I think there's something more insidious here too. There's this, I think, actually makes it less likely that anyone would be overly would be all that urgently pursuing abolition. It's actually preventative. It's actually an obstacle to seeing abolition, because what the text is saying is that in the world, in the real world, we have these social categories: slave free, man, woman, Jew, Gentile. We have these real categories, but in Christ, those aren't there. So because we're all in Christ, you don't actually have to do anything about this stuff down here, right? Because all that matters is what's up here. So don't worry about, you know, providing equal rights for women. Don't worry about abolishing slavery. Don't worry about changing your relationships with people, with foreigners and people from other cultures, because that doesn't matter.
Wow, dude,
Because
that's
we're
probably
all
that's
one in Christ.
wow,
And
dude. That's
and
probably the best take on that text I've ever heard. Like, that's absolutely brilliant.
but here's
Not mine.
here's the thing. If it's viewed as just like apocalyptic literature, if it's viewed as from the bottom, from the oppressed, from those that are under the burden, there's a purpose to that message that I can understand. Right? Look, you can't get out of your slavery right now, right? Or if you're in apocalyptic literature, you're being oppressed, under Hellenistic rule or whatever. And you can't get out of that. But just hang on. Think about the spiritual side of this. You're chained in the basement right now, but look, think about when you get out. It's going to happen. Don't worry. Keep faith. It's what we tell POWs, right? Keep faith. Keep faith. It's a survival technique. And if it's viewed in that light, like, it's much easier to deal with. When it becomes insidious is when apocalyptic literature and passages like Galatians 3:28 get co-opted by those in power.
Yeah.
Because then they can turn the message around to the have-nots and say, look, it doesn't matter that you're poor. I mean, look, it doesn't matter that you're struggling, because what really matters is who you are in Christ. That's what really matters. Right.
Yeah,
So,
and like, it's such a sick story too, because now we're delving into what I would call full preterism, because that's where I landed, and everything is spiritualized. Like, oh, you're in chains. One day Jesus is going to come back, and the whole idea is going to be soon. And what happens? And then the resolution is, oh, you didn't realize it was spiritual. Oh, because that benefits me so much when I'm chained in a prison. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's sick, and that was one of the reasons why I think ultimately I ended up waking up, because I just was like, what is this garbage? It's all spiritualized. Like, it's just all taken on faith. Like, I don't have any actual benefits here. And neither did they in the first century, which was the ones that were actually promised all these things. So it becomes absolutely ludicrous, man. So I know we need to wrap up, because first of all, this is the longest show I've ever done yet. And it's well merited, though, because you guys were awesome. This was such a good show. And I'm sure there's much more we can talk about. And I don't want to cut you short. And if you guys have anything else in particular to share before I do my bookend, I'll give you the floor.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
I think I'm good too, actually.
Good. Okay, perfect. So one of the things we see in the New Testament is Jesus proclaiming that he has come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And especially as a full preterist, one of the things we argued was that, he fulfilled every single part of the law, right? And every single part. Kipp touched on this and kind of gave me the preview for the end here at the very beginning of the show. And it is this: where else did Christ fulfill the law of slavery that God endorsed and gave in the old covenant, other than through all of his bond slaves that the apostles, especially as a righteous, I'm a bond servant of Christ, I'm a bond servant of Christ, or I'm a slave of Christ, depending on what translation you read. You're reading. In what way did he fulfill it? In that way. Christ has slaves for all eternity. Is that not sick? Like that is how he fulfilled all the laws. And it makes you start to wonder. And when you start to actually evaluate all the laws and how they were done, what's our worth then in Christ? If we're in Christ, I don't even believe that's a thing, but if we're in Christ, it means we're worthless, useless, don't need you need to be deserved as anything of any value, or owned, or property. But that, in fact, is the true message of Christianity. You're a sinner worthy of nothing. You need Jesus as your savior. Become his slave for life. That's the message. It is sick, and I am glad I'm out of that garbage. Anyway, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I'm glad that people are free to interpret the text differently. Going back to that video that Kipp and I and Vishanti reviewed, where that guy was laying into the doctor who was
the Reverend Dr.
Reverend,
Rebecca Todd Peters. She
who
says I
was-
can call her Toddy, by the way. So it's pretty cool.
But you know, the freedom.
What do you mean by that, Josh? Like, you're glad people can interpret the text in different ways. What do you mean by that?
You know, I think that you and Kipp and I grew up in such a way that we were told the text is inspired, it's inerrant, and down to the grammatical morphemes, and Scripture interprets Scripture, and it interprets it in this way, right? This is the lens through which we've viewed the text. And in the same way, there's a painting opposite me right now that one of our amazing supporters made for us of the Ishtar Gate, and it's that Mushkushu dragon, if you're familiar with it, and it's just beautiful blue and white and brown brick wall behind it, and this golden Mushkushu dragon. And, it's an amazing painting. I might look at that and feel very warm and fuzzy and uplifted and strong. Somebody else who has, for example, researched the depths of Neo-Assyrian warfare presentations, who had a grandfather that served in World War II or something, who died horrifically, might see that and make a connection between Neo-Assyrian warfare and their history and struggles with warfare, and feel very, very sad about that painting. I have no right to turn to that person and say you're wrong about your interpretation, nor do they have the right to turn to me and say you're wrong about your interpretation, because the way that I interpret that painting and the way that they interpret that painting is perfectly legitimate. And in the same way, people come to ancient texts or groups of texts and see them through the lens of their own life experiences. And that's a good thing. I think when it becomes a bad thing is when people dictate, here is how you must see those texts through this lens. And now you must hold other people accountable to this interpretation through this lens. And that's where I think it becomes very problematic. So I'm glad that people can read the Epic of Gilgamesh and not get hung up on the atrocities of killing Humbaba. But instead, they can look at Gilgamesh weeping over Enkidu for 7 days and then realizing his own mortality and think, man, that inspires me to live my life to the fullest. Right? I'm glad that we can do that.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. And that's right. It's right in the vein of it's almost a mission statement at this point for me, for my channel, for the work that I'm doing on YouTube and in public spaces. The Reverend Dr. Peters said that the Bible is to be studied. It's not this fixed, rigid thing that that is to be, enforced. It's actually a fairly modern idea. The idea that the three of us unfortunately inherited. The way Professor David Carr put it, Professor David Carr from Union Seminary, the Bible is a conversation. The way Josh just now talked about how we all bring our own lived experiences to the text, I would say we all see ourselves in the text, and since we're already in this conversation, then like we have the power to take it in whatever direction we want. So yeah, let's be honest about what the text is. There's a lot of terrible things in there. It came out of a world that was in many respects awful, and one which we should all be thankful we're no longer part of. But the way we got from there to here was by reading these texts over and seeing them in new perspectives, and looking for being able to recognize the warts in there, and to enact the changes necessary to ensure that they're not propagated. So yeah,
Well
let's
said.
do that. You too, man.
Yeah. Well, great. I mean, and I like that insight. I mean, yeah, we should have, and I'm glad we have the freedom to interpret and discuss. Do I wish that all people would just interpret the Bible the way they would all other historical and mythical texts? Yes.
Why not?
And
right?
Wouldn't that be great?
Do I think that the world would be in a better place without theism? Yes, I certainly do. But that is the beauty of freedom. And I am a big advocate of freedom, and I do not think that there should be ever a way that we should suppress religious thought processes in these matters. I think we should dialogue about them as we're doing tonight. And we welcome people to dialogue with us, and you have the freedom to believe whatever you wish, and to you guys' points, and I appreciate that. So that is a good way to end the show, and I think that was wonderful. Everybody shared some thoughts here. I hope you saw all the problems with the text regarding slavery and the endorsement of it from the Bible, and especially God's role in it and dictating laws for it. And you have a decision to make. If you are still a theist, you have to decide, or especially a Christian theist, is this God the kind of God that you want to follow? I think Josh, Kipp, and I would all say he's immoral. But
is this really the hill you guys want to die on?
Yeah, right.
That's right.
Right.
Come on.
There is actually a way to live that is wonderful that doesn't require a God. Morality isn't necessary. It doesn't necessitate a God, especially one that gives instructions on how to perform slavery and rape and murder and pedophilia. Like, you got to think through these things, guys. So that's what we're challenging you with. You have the right to think what you want, but by all means, please think through these things. It has been absolutely an honor, Josh, Kipp. Thank you guys for gracing the Unraveler show with your presence. I'm so grateful for you guys. What a great show. And if you're watching, share this, because people need to see this episode. There was so much content here, so much good stuff that I think it'll challenge people's thinking. So please share it. Make sure everybody has a chance to watch this episode. And I certainly hope we have a chance to do this again on some other topic at some point. So thank you guys so much. If you are watching, please subscribe if you haven't. And at the end of the show, check below in the info, all of the stuff there about Kipp's show, Josh's book on slavery, and anything else about what Josh is doing is down there. You can also support me in the different various ways down there. Right now, my book, How to Kill God the Easy Way, is available on Amazon. I am releasing a second edition with a different title very, very soon. For some reason, it turns out Christians don't like the title How to Kill God the Easy Way. Who knew? What? What? How do you not like that title?
You can't kill God.
Exactly. Apparently, it hurts their feelings. So, anyway, and I get it. I guess I get it. I mean, when I was a Christian, that would have totally done it for me. I'd have been like, "Oh my God, that's the coolest title ever." But apparently, I was a very odd Christian. So, so anyway, we are changing the title, and it's far better now. Anyway, got a lot of testimonials on there, a lot of new material. But anyway, if you're interested, currently that's what's available. How to kill God the easy way. Then the new version will be out soon. But thank you all for watching. Josh, Kipp, you guys are awesome. Thanks for being here tonight. Everybody.
Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good night.